The silence of the highlands was not a gift. It was a heavy shroud, waiting to be torn apart by the ghosts of the past. In the heart of this stillness sat a simple wooden shack, its timber weathered by 1,000 storms, housing a love that the world deemed illegal. Inside, James sat on a low stool, his large frame making the small room feel even tighter, his fingers tracing the rough grain of the table he had built with his own calloused hands. He was no longer the CEO who signed billion-dollar deals in glass towers. He was a man seeking redemption in the dust. Can a man truly bury his royal blood beneath the dirt of a peasant's floor? James believed so, as long as the scent of wood smoke and Diep's presence remained his only currency. Suddenly, the heavy thud of a car door slamming shattered the peace like a gunshot. A sleek black SUV, a mechanical beast from James's former life, stood at the edge of their muddy yard, its headlights piercing the mist like the eyes of a predator. James stood up, his muscles tensing under a damp, soot-stained shirt, his jaw set in a line of granite. He stepped onto the porch just as two men in sharp suits stepped into the mud, holding a thick folder that looked like a death warrant. Their polished shoes were quickly swallowed by the mire, a stark reminder that the elite have no place in a world of honest toil. Why does the shadow of gold always try to extinguish the flickering candle of a simple life? The lead man didn't offer a greeting. He threw a stack of legal papers onto the wooden porch, the white sheets fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. Mr. Hahn's patience has expired, James. He has bought this entire hillside. This shack is now officially a pile of kindling. The man sneered, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a man who serves a king. James didn't blink. He reached down, grabbed the papers, and with a single violent motion, tore them in half, the sound of rending paper echoing through the valley. He stepped off the porch, his heavy boots sinking into the mud, and stood inches away from the intruder, his breath visible in the fettingly air. Is a piece of paper stronger than the back of a man who has carried stones for the woman he loves? James grabbed a heavy iron spade leaning against the wall and drove it into the earth at the man's feet, a clear line drawn in the dirt. He then turned back to the house, ignored the threats, and began to haul massive logs from the side of the yard to reinforce the porch. He swung a heavy mallet, the sound of wood hitting wood a rhythmic anthem of defiance, his sweat beginning to steam in the cold mountain air. Every strike was a message to his father. You can buy the land, but you cannot buy the soul of the man who tilled it. James refused to look at the luxury car. His eyes were fixed on the door where Diep stood, her face pale but her spirit unbroken. Mrs. Huyen stepped out from the shadows of the house, her elegant quilted jacket a sharp contrast to the rotting wood, her hand resting gently on Diep's trembling shoulder. She looked at the men from the city with a gaze that held the wisdom of 1,000 Shatai winters, a silent shield protecting the fragile peace of the lovers. She didn't speak, but her presence was a bridge between the cruelty of the empire and the sanctity of the shack. How many secrets must a mother carry to ensure her son's happiness doesn't cost him his life? The intruders retreated as the sky began to weep, a cold drizzle turning the yard into a battlefield of slush. James didn't stop. He hoisted a heavy bag of grain onto his shoulder, his knees creaking under the weight, and moved it into the dry corner of the house to protect Diep's hard-earned 90 million VND profit. He then knelt in the mud to fix a broken floorboard, his hands shaking from the cold, but his grip as steady as an anchor. True kings do not wear crowns. They wear the bam time of labor and the dirt of sacrifice. By the time the fire was lit inside, James was a mess of gray mud and exhaustion, his damp clothes clinging to his shivering frame. He sat by the hearth, the orange glow reflecting in his glasses, his eyes finally softening as Nee ran to him with a small bowl of warm water. Diep knelt beside him, her lotus-collared shirt damp from the mist, her fingers trembling as she wiped a streak of grease from his cheek. Look at the contrast in the firelight. The hands that once ruled an empire are now raw and bruised, yet they have never felt more powerful. In this simple wooden house, happiness wasn't found in the dividends of a corporation, but in the silence shared between three souls who had chosen the noble poverty over a gilded cage. The storm outside finally exhaled its last freezing breaths, leaving a world drowned in gray slush and a silence that pressed heavily against the wooden walls of the shack. James did not allow himself to rest, even as fatigue threatened to pull him into the abyss. He grabbed a heavy wooden bucket, his knuckles white against the rough handle, and hauled it to the water barrel. He poured the freezing liquid into a soot-stained iron pot, his muscles rippling under his mud-caked shirt. Why do we build towers of gold when the only sanctuary that matters is the one we guard with our own sweat? James knelt on the floor, ignoring the sharp pain in his knees, and scrubbed the trail of mud with a coarse cloth. He moved a massive trunk of firewood closer to the hearth, the timber groaning under his grip, before turning to Diep. True power is not found in the ability to move markets, but in the calloused palms that can rub life back into a loved one's frozen fingers. James took Diep's small hands into his own, his skin like sandpaper against her softness, and massaged them with focused intensity. He leaned in, the firelight reflecting off his gold-rimmed glasses, his breath hitching as color returned to her cheeks. He stayed silent, for his silence was a fortress built to keep the cruelty of his father's world at bay. Is it a crime to choose the scent of wood smoke over the sterile air of a boardroom, if it means finding your lost soul? James wrapped a heavy quilted blanket around Diep's shoulders, his hand lingering on the delicate fabric of her lotus-collared shirt. He then stood and secured the heavy iron bolt on the door with 3 powerful strikes of his palm. Nye sat on a low bench, her eyes wide as she watched the silent protector move through the small space like a captive king. James reached into his indigo-patterned bag, searching through the grit until his fingers found a hidden package of dried ginger. He knelt before the child and placed the offering into her tiny hands with a fleeting shadow of a smile. He then hoisted a heavy bag of grain, the fibers biting into his bruised shoulder, and moved it to a higher shelf. If a man is defined by what he protects, then James was a titan, guarding a harvest as if it were crown jewels. He grabbed a heavy iron poker and stoked the fire, the embers dancing in the air like defiant stars caught in a wooden cage. Mrs. Huyen moved silently from the shadows, her elegant jacket a haunting reminder of the luxury they had left behind in Hatay. She watched her son, her eyes brimming with a secret sorrow carried through 25 years of shadow. She placed a tattered yellow envelope on the rough table, her fingers trembling against the grain of the wood. How much of our identity is built on the lies our parents told us to keep us safe from the truth? James looked at the paper as if it were a scorching coal, his knuckles turning white under the strain of indecision. He gripped the edge of the table, his mind a battlefield where the empire fought the shack for dominance. James walked to the window, peering through the cracks at the black SUV still idling at the edge of the yard. He moved a heavy stone to reinforce the threshold, his muscles bulging with a frantic, desperate energy. He then turned to Diep, who was watching him with an expression of pure, unadulterated trust. If the light of truth only serves to burn the garden of your happiness, would you choose to live forever in the dark? James tore the seal with a violent suddenness, pulling out a single silver key and a photograph of a forgotten face. Suddenly, a heavy knock, 3 slow, thunderous strikes echoed through the shack, shaking the very foundation of their wooden sanctuary. James dropped the letter, his hand instinctively grabbing a heavy iron mallet from the floor as he stepped in front of Diep and Nye, his body an unbreakable wall of flesh and bone. He didn't ask who was there. He simply stood his ground, his sweat dripping onto the dry wood, his intense gaze focused on the door as if he could see the betrayal waiting on the other side. Through the gaps in the timber, a tall, shadowy figure stood in the mist, holding up a phone that displayed a live feed of the very boardroom James had abandoned. The figure didn't speak, but the message was clear. The Empire had found him, and it was coming to claim its heir, or bury him in the mud. James felt the silver key in his pocket, a cold reminder of the wealth that could save Diep's stocks or destroy her heart. Would you trade your soul for the gold that could save your love? Or would you let the world burn to keep your hands clean? James looked directly into the camera, the firelight catching the fierce determination in his eyes as he prepared to open the door to his destiny.
Sự yên bình nơi cao nguyên nhanh chóng bị phá vỡ khi người đàn ông của Mr. Hoàng xuất hiện, mang theo giấy tờ tuyên bố đã mua lại toàn bộ khu đất và buộc Jame rời đi. Thay vì khuất phục, Jame xé nát văn bản và dùng sức lao động để bảo vệ mái nhà, dựng lại hiên và cất giữ thành quả kinh doanh nhỏ mà Diep gây dựng. Trong căn nhà gỗ đơn sơ, anh chăm sóc Diep và Nhi bằng đôi tay chai sạn, lựa chọn nghèo cao quý thay cho quyền lực cũ. Mẹ Huyền âm thầm đưa cho anh một phong bì chứa chìa khóa và bức ảnh quá khứ, gợi lại thân phận mà anh cố quên. Khi bóng người lạ xuất hiện cùng hình ảnh phòng họp trên điện thoại, James hiểu rằng đế chế cũ đã đến. Giờ đây anh đứng trước lựa chọn nghiệt ngã, quay lại quyền lực để bảo vệ người mình yêu hay tiếp tục giữ lấy cuộc sống giản dị bằng mọi giá.